When justice gives way to vengeance, when an unstoppable force and an immovable object are forced into battle with one another, when the lives of your family, loved ones, and justice itself balances at the tip of a sword, that is when you will know the importance of the duel. Hello everyone and welcome back to Desks and Dorks. I am Kyle, I am the Dork. A couple of things: if you like historically based role-playing content and you want to continue to support the work that we here at Desks and Dorks do, the best ways to do so and help support us are to join the Patreon. You get early access to Desks and Dorks content, your name credited as one of our supporters and contributors, and you get a role-playing game every single month for joining. If you want digital copies, you can use that QR code to get yourself a copy of any of our PDFs, but if you're a person who likes physical copies, you can get them from Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, and Exalted Funeral. But with that out of the way, let's cover what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to cover the importance of duels, misconceptions surrounding the idea of a duel, and common features associated with dueling, as well as how to use those things in our games. As always, two disclaimers: I was trained as a Eurocentric medievalist. That means that I'm going to be leaving out a lot of different parts of the world. Those time periods, those cultures, not only are they worth engaging with, but they have a lot of really interesting stuff on duels. I just don't think that I have the training to represent those cultures with the nuance and respect that they deserve. Also, if you're going to lean into some of the more messed up stuff that surrounds duels, I would encourage you to use some safety tools, communication tools, whatever you want to call them, just to make sure that your players are okay and you know that everyone is having a good time at the table. So with that out of the way, let's start with the misconceptions, because more than anything else, I truly believe that duels get a bad rap in popular culture. Not because they're used poorly, they're often used as great storytelling devices, designs, whatever, but because I think that they're not very true or accurate to the way that duels were fought, particularly in the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance. And those misconceptions, I think, actually take away from some of the more interesting parts of the duel. You see, the first one is the idea that the duel is commonplace. If you watch media centered in the Middle Ages or the medieval time period, you would think that everyone is walking around dueling all of the freaking time. And the truth of the matter is that nothing could be further from how it actually was. Now, again, partially this is because it's interesting. It shows off the technology of the time period, the wonderful articulated armor, the savagery of medieval combat, and it just makes for really highly dynamic and evocative fights. I love a good duel in a piece of media. But again, they're usually only for entertainment or sometimes for punishment. Remember, the average medieval person is like you or I. They want to be entertained and they want to find ways to pass the time. One of the most popular ways of doing this was in watching duels during tournament season. Now, again, these are not like the duels to the death that are depicted in medieval media or modern media about the Middle Ages, but they're more like a boxing match or a UFC bout. Again, this would be common during tournaments. It was seen, actually, Knight still does a pretty good job of this, kind of seen as a lesser glory, a lesser honor for a tournament night to win one of these, but these were still knockdown, drag out, savage brawls, and they were a really, really good time to do so. So again, I like this. By the way, this picture is really interesting because it depicts the audience of this being armored, and something that often gets left out is even during wartime, you would have to duel sometimes for entertainment, because let's be real here for a second, fighting with the homeboys for fun is still a thing that people do. So yeah, you would be expected sometimes to duel with your friends as a form of entertainment or exhibition. This is fairly common. Now, judicial duels were fought. That is another thing that we have to talk about. The idea of a duel as punishment does exist. However, these were both A, very rare, B, usually very specialized, and I'm going to explain this picture in just a second, and C, not just were they rare, not just were they specialized, they also still kind of fall under the realms of entertainment. Remember, to the person in the Middle Ages, going to something like capital punishment was seen as a form of entertainment. This particular duel, by the way, had these sort of judicial strictures placed on it, right? So in this instance, an individual would be placed in a waist-high hole or pit. They would be given a long, sharp object, which they would try to use to hamstring someone. And then on top of that, what would happen? Oh, well, this individual right here would be armed with either a long post or long pole, something along those things, or a flail-like object. This basically looks like the medieval equivalent of a tube sock full of lug nuts, which I think is absolutely hilarious. Again, this is barbaric by most standards of doing things, but it was a way of sort of equalizing the playing field for both combatants. It's a very strange thing, but again, falls into that sort of entertainment and judicial duel. Now, there is a judicial duel that takes place that exists as the exception to the rule. This is the duel between Jacques Legris and Jean de Carouge. These are two French knights. Now, here is the issue that we're going to be talking about at hand. This duel exemplifies all of the misconceptions by essentially being the exact archetypal Hollywood-level duel, to the point that it was made into a movie in 2021, The Last Duel, featuring Matt Damon and Adam Driver. The movie, not very good, by the way, not good as an adaptation, and not really good as a film either, but it does highlight the importance of this event, and I'll walk you through the timeline because I think it does a great job of showing why these misconceptions matter. One, this battle takes place between two members of the aristocracy. Both Jacques and Jean were incredibly influential in their courts or locally, and as a result of that, the fact that this duel was allowed to take place at all is significant. Another misconception that happens with duels is usually, if they took place between the upper crust and the nobility, they didn't go through. Usually people's influential friends or family members would step in to prevent it. Two, these battles were usually not fought till the bitter end. In this case, not only was it allowed to go to the bitter end, the King of France himself sanctioned it. And three, duels that were beyond entertainment were usually only going to be a matter of local spectacle, but this was one that drew in crowds of thousands. So again, this is all of the reasons that Hollywood gets duels wrong, and this is the one time that it happens. It's important for us to bring it about now, but it goes to show a lot of the misconceptions. Usually, if there was a duel or a matter of honor between two men of high birth or nobility or the knighthood, it never got to the extent where one of them would get absolutely and completely vibe checked by a mace. Something that's important to take into account. And speaking of honor, by the way, there's this sort of misconception in dueling culture of people willingly letting each other duke it out in a sort of sacred space, the 1v1 me bro of the Middle Ages. And this is 1000% not true or correct. Knights are, shockingly enough, because many of them are spoiled, rich, and essentially had never had to deal with anybody forcing them to play by the rules. Knights were notorious for cheating at duels. If they thought that their side was losing or their friend was losing, oh boy, were you going to get absolutely brutalized by a bunch of knights riding in. This happens, by the way, in a trial by combat that happened before a battle. One of the things that occurs in this battle during the 100 Years' War is that a couple different knights, French knights, and versed a couple English knights and their German mercenary friends in a 12v12. The rules were simple. No horseback. If you were beaten to the ground, you had to surrender yourself willingly and you would sit on the sidelines. Kind of like a match of dodgeball. Essentially what happened is the French were losing. The guys who had been quote-unquote sidelined snuck off, got their horses, and then rode down the other people like dominoes, and then the battle started anyway. Again, this is legitimately just like playing dodgeball in middle school, and there's one kid who keeps getting hit and is 1,000 like, no, I didn't get hit at all. I'm not saying that knights are basically as good at following rules as middle schoolers who treat dodgeball like a life and death event, but I am saying that medieval knights are, in many cases, just as whiny as middle schoolers who treat dodgeball like a life and death event. Cheating happened a lot, and it happened a lot more if you were of noble birth and knew you could get away with it. And lastly, speaking of that nobility clause, there's more than one class of duelist. For whatever reason, popular media tends to depict duels as the parlance of and the property of the real estate, so to speak, of the upper class and the nobility. But the truth is that duels happened everywhere to everyone and were sanctioned, quote unquote, either officially or unofficially, in the same ways that the duels of the nobility were. We have medieval fighting manuals and Renaissance fighting manuals, for example, of street toughs and thugs who would use short rapiers and daggers as well as their cloaks in order to duke things out. In medieval England or Renaissance England, actually going into the the Elizabethan period, we have fighting manuals for English men about town who would use their canes and essentially dual-wield either cane and dagger or dual-wield canes like batons, like Daredevil, to fight each other in the streets. It would not have been uncommon for people to choose weapons of their choice, and common ones did include daggers and clubs, in addition to things like swords and later on, pistols, which is kind of an important thing to take into account. But the lower class, in many cases, demanded satisfaction in the same ways that the nobility or the upper class would. And so if you're going to have a town or a city that is inspired by dueling culture, make sure that it, of course, works with and works around these other classes as well, because it does matter and it is connected. But now that we've covered some of the most important historical misconceptions, let's talk about the types of duels and duelists or dueling that I think would be great inspiration for your tabletop campaigns. I have talked about my love of the Norse culture many times before. It's actually what my specialization was in. My final paper defense to get my bachelor's degree in medieval history was on the Icelandic sagas. So I have a little bit of authority in talking about this, but one of the not common jobs, I should say, but one of the things that did happen were a series of extrajudicial duels called holmgangs. These would take place usually on an island or a cordoned off area of town, or in some cases on a strip of fur to act as a quote of island in the middle of a street. But essentially what could happen is two people could fight for possessions or fight to settle grievances. You even had what I think is the craziest job ever. You had people called holmgangers who were professional judicial duelists who would essentially step in to assist someone who was either unable, unwilling, or just really wanted to hire a ringer to handle their holmgang themselves. Shockingly enough, this had two big knock-on effects in Nordic regions. One, you had professional holmgangers who would come in, literally choose to pick a fight for some perceived slight, real or not, as an excuse to execute somebody and get their property. You also, of course, had the issue of the rich and the wealthy using this as a way to get out of extrajudicial combat, because you knew even if you had a legitimate grievance, if it comes down to a holmgang, that the wealthy landowner, wealthy jarl, wealthy thane, whatever, could simply hire one of the best warriors, somebody whose entire job it was to fight extrajudicial duels like this one. That matters. I think that's relatively important, and it's a really cool thing. I also want to point out that the dueling culture, this is not medieval. I'm pivoting a little bit to American history, but it's something I really think is interesting. But the city of New Orleans had an incredible dueling culture. I read a little bit about this one. This was a Association for Historical Fencing, but there's a bunch of different resources on this that you can look up. It was really, really interesting. But there's a sort of gentlemanly, dandy-esque culture of chauvinistic and perceived masculinity, where it's like, oh no, like I demand satisfaction and I will have that satisfaction by any means necessary. And what's interesting about this is that these duels were so deadly and so prevalent that they became a massive problem, eventually leading to the practice of duels being banned in the city of New Orleans entirely. Now, I'm going to offer one historical caveat. Shockingly enough, the Joe Rogan podcast, not a great place for historical verisimilitude. They had a historian on there talking about dueling cards, essentially like business cards with a location, your name, and a signature, so that you would hand them to somebody and be like, cool, we're going to duel at this time. I did as much research as I could looking for that, and I could not find that to be verified in any legitimate sense. I found people talking about it online, but I didn't find any sources backing it up. So if anybody has access to those sources, please let me know. But again, the Joe Rogan podcast, not the shining bastion for historical integrity. Shocker. But again, it was interesting. And if I hadn't seen that clip, I probably wouldn't have done the research on dueling in the old historical days of New Orleans, but I think it's really cool that an entire city was essentially gripped with dueling fever, that it became sort of a part of the local culture. I think that's kind of neat. Could serve for great inspiration for a campaign. And last but certainly not least, I have to talk about the Renaissance era street toughs. There is an entire series of fighting manuals that take place in Renaissance era Italy and in other places like it, but mostly in Italy and some places in Sicily, of street duels. So literally how to fight with rapier and dagger, how to fight with two daggers, how to fight with stick and dagger, cape and rapier. It's really interesting that this sort of pervasive dueling climate existed not just in places like New Orleans, but throughout all of Renaissance Italy, and led to both the formation of some great gangs, but also helped the condottieri, which are the Italian Renaissance mercenary armies, to find individuals to recruit. They sort of acted almost not like a special forces, but to at least grab people like that, which I think is kind of cool. If you're looking for individuals of a certain bent to join your condottieri band, I think it's actually very similar to more fantasy properties like Darkest Dungeon or Battle Brothers, where you're sort of plucking individuals of a certain bent into your warband and pressing them into service, which I think is pretty neat. But finally, let's talk about duels for our game. I have 3 different ways that I think you could incorporate duels and duelists in general into your game, inspired by the historical stuff that we have talked about today. The first one, I think, is you should really lean into different dueling schools. Just like the Italian Renaissance gangs, or even the gangs of the Roman Republic would have done, they specialized in certain things. And so I think if you had fencing schools or dueling schools, I think that's a really good idea. You could, for example, make a school that gives you additional bonuses to attack and to protection when you are faced with multiple opponents, because you're so used to the enemy cheating that you're used to being able to take on multiple people when you're supposed to be fighting a duel. Part of cape and rapier or cape and dagger combat that I think is really interesting is the inherent deception of it. The billowing nature of the cape, not only is it used to sort of grapple the weapon away from the person or to take down their limb, but it's also used to sort of help you set up feints in combat, as well as to deceive your opponent as to where your next strike is coming to. And I think it'd be interesting if there was a dueling school that allowed for deception, bluffing, the sort of charismatic things that some people treat as dump stats, depending on what system you're in, to translate to an advantage in combat. I think that would be pretty sweet. The other thing that I think you should do, and I think this is pretty interesting, is I would add momentum dueling. This is my favorite thing, by the way, that I've come up with for the dueling systems. But it's a metagame currency that it starts at 0 and accrues for both combatants throughout the duel. Each round, you get a point. So you're guaranteed to get 1 point every single round of combat. Each hit gets you an additional point, and if you did critical hit if you're playing D&D or another D20 system, or if you force the enemy to take exhaustion if you're playing Root or Savage Lands, if you're engaging in max damage if you're playing Shadow the Demon Lord, anything like that also gives you 2 points. And what I think is cool is that you could then, as the GM, set up your menu for how to spend those points. I didn't put points values here because I want you as the GM to sort of think about how you might want to balance that for your game, and also to keep this setting and system agnostic, as all of our videos are. But like, you could add things like bonus attacks, max damage, an additional turn. You can spend it so that the next time they attack, you immediately get a disarm, advantage or disadvantage on a roll, etc., etc. But the idea of this is that this meta currency is dispelled at the end of the duel. Because you don't want the player hoarding this. You want the player cashing in on this, using it, and spending it. A smoke 'em if you got 'em mentality, I think, is exactly what we're looking for with something like this. And I want to encourage players to engage in the combat in ways that will add additional momentum points. So if you want to reward a player for high-flying acrobatic dueling, give them the points that they need for certain actions to encourage that level of play. Make the meta currency go away at the end of the combat, because then the player is A, going to do the stuff to get meta currency, and B, going to spend it rather than try to sandbag it or save it. A lot of RPG players are hoarders, but I think this is the great way of doing things. And finally, I really wanted to lean into the beef, baby. I want to lean into that 1v1 rivalry, that sweet, sweet hatred, that Kendrick Lamar versus Drake level of despising somebody. This is letting your beef level up. So if you are engaging in a game where duels are a key part of it, what I think you should do is have a sworn enemy. So every time that you fight the enemy, and they both survive, you get access to a new ability, like leveling up, essentially. But as the game progresses, you're going to get more and more abilities to use, but those abilities only work on the enemy. You can only use them when you're in 1v1 combat with the enemy. However, you are encouraged to let this rivalry go on, because if you do, and then you slay your enemy, you can keep 2 of the abilities to use against anybody permanently, which means the longer you let the beef level up, the better abilities you're going to get. But if I'm a GM, and I'm planning on using this system, oh man, am I going to make the consequences for continuing to let the beef go that much greater. Like, I want there to be social and political pressure from the different people in your city to get these guys to bury the hatchet or bury the sword, whatever. because the longer you can make this a push your luck, high risk, high reward scenario with the sweet, sweet taste of oblivion at the end of a rapier point the whole way, chef's kiss. I think it's a great way of doing things. Also, I love the idea that your beef has a level just like your character might in the game that you're playing. And I think that's pretty sweet. And with that, my friends, that brings us to the end of today's video. I hope that you have enjoyed this. Again, all the YouTube pleasantries, the liking, the sharing, the commenting, the subscribing, they help an awful lot. Again, if you're interested in getting an RPG every month, or your name in the credits, or I should say, and your name in the credits, and early access to our content, this is the best way to do so. That link will take, that QR code will take you to the Patreon. Again, of course, you can get our stuff over at itch.io and our physical copies from all of those wonderful people I mentioned at the beginning who have links in the description below. And again, a huge thank you to Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, Exalted Funeral. Those are the people that you can get our games from. But an even bigger thank you to Dionysus, to Chris Bates, to Agile Monk, Ignacio Zeggers, and Aiden Delaney, who's our newest patron, who has joined us. Thank you all, gentlemen, for helping me to bring this type of content to life. It means the absolute world to me. Thank you all so much. And thank you to those of you who are still watching. I'm Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks. You've all been amazing, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.